Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Sheila Presley, and I oversee education, interpretation, and public programs at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Gunn Theater at the Legion of Honor on this very, very beautiful Saturday. As I hope many of you know, the Fine Arts Museums are comprised of both the Legion and the de Young in Golden Gate Park. And one of the things we are particularly proud of is the fact that every Saturday we are free to all inhabitants of the Bay Area. Our permanent collections at both museums are free every Saturday. Thank you. I am particularly delighted to welcome you to the Closer Look Lecture Series, which is a popular series now entering its second year. And may I ask how many of you have attended a Closer Look lecture in the past? All right, great. Well, we have developed a loyal following, but those of you who are new to the Closer Look lecture, let me tell you that on the second Saturday of each month, a curator will talk about one aspect of their collection, the collection they oversee, that particularly excites them, and they will share it with the public. So it's a wonderful opportunity for visitors to hear from the people who care for, know, and interpret the collections. And on this lovely March Saturday, I'm particularly happy to welcome our Closer Look curator, Dr. Sally Martin Katz. Dr. Katz is the associate curator at the Achenbach Collection for Graphic Arts here at the Fine Arts Museums. This is a position she has held since 2024. And in a relatively short period of time, she has made some significant, important acquisitions to the collection. She spearheaded the acquisition of works by Walker Evan, Diane Arbus, and Carrie Mae Weems, among others. We are truly fortunate to have her remarkable expertise. Dr. Katz holds an MFA in photography and a PhD in art history from the Sorbonne. Before joining the Fine Arts Museums, Dr. Katz held various roles at SFMOMA, the Cartier-Bresson Foundation, and the Louvre. Through her really careful curation, Dr. Katz makes our vast collection of photography come alive for our visitors, and she really tells the stories behind the works of art. And we can witness this really careful curation over at the de Young right now in the small exhibition Boom and Bust, Photography of Northern California, which will be on view through August 2nd. It's a project she worked on, and I really encourage you all to get over there and see it if you haven't yet. Today, we're going to talk about a project opening here at the Legion on August 22nd. It's an exhibition called Eternal Paris, 19th and 20th Century Photography. This is a show that obviously Dr. Katz is curating, and this talk today will be a sneak preview. This project in particular is really very fitting for Dr. Katz, who has held several professional appointments in Paris, as well as her PhD studies. So I think we're in for a real treat today. And I want to ask you to help me welcome Dr. Katz to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, Sheila. Hello, everyone. I'm Sally Martin Katz, and I'm the photography curator here at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. And today, I'm delighted to participate in this exciting curatorial lecture series, A Closer Look, where we offer a deep dive into the collections housed here at the Legion of Honor. I'd also like to thank my colleague Emily Beanie for organizing this lecture series, and for my colleagues across multiple departments in the museum, including education, public programs, and AV, for making this program possible. So what do we think about when we think about Paris? The chances are that most of us, even if we've never been to Paris, will conjure images of the Eiffel Tower or monumental buildings, of street scenes and cafes, the River Seine, and the grand boulevards. But the Paris that exists in our popular imagination, I will argue, is shaped by the medium of photography. My lecture, titled Eternal Paris, explores how French photographers from the 19th and early 20th centuries used the camera to celebrate and preserve the cultural and architectural heritage of Paris, and in doing so, were part of a myth-making of Parisian identity that continues to this day. So the photographs I present today, as Sheila mentioned, will form the basis of an exhibition that will be on view in Gallery 22 here at the Legion of Honor, that will open on August 22nd and run through February 28th of 2027. So I've divided the lecture into 4 sections, beginning with the influence of the Mission Héliographique, a government project that employed photographers to survey the built environment and glorify what they saw as the architectural and cultural patrimony of their country. The second section will present photographs of the aftermath of the insurrection that brought about the Paris Commune of 1871, depicting the city in ruins and the enormous task of rebuilding that lay ahead when the Republic was reunited. The third section will feature a series of works by Charles Marville and Eugène Atget, who chronicled Paris pre- and post-Haussmannization, the dramatic redevelopment of Paris by Napoleon III's visionary urban planner, Baron Georges Eugène Haussmann. I want to home in on the notion of a before and after, and demonstrate photographers' impulse to use the camera to preserve old Paris, or Vieux Paris, a city already changed by the forces of modernization. Lastly, I will present a series of pictures that are linked by a characteristic often associated with photographers of Paris: the desire to capture and celebrate the city's energy and vibrant street life. Above all, my lecture demonstrates the importance of the dissemination and circulation of photographs, and how these processes contributed to crafting a publicly recognizable image of Paris in our collective mind's eye. Photography as a medium played a critical role in cementing the image of Paris that is part of our popular imagination and the ongoing myth-making of Parisian identity. So the earliest photographers of Paris were in part limited by the constraints of the new medium. Photography in the mid-19th century was in its infancy, a much more deliberate, slower, and more time-consuming process than it is today. But while photographers who were working outside the studio were naturally drawn to scenes that were unmoving and more easily captured, they were also drawn specifically to document and record the monumental architecture of their city. Paris was an ancient city, and many of the most iconic and impressive buildings and urban spaces had been in existence for centuries and seemed likely to endure for centuries more. In choosing to make them the subject of their photography, therefore, mid-19th century French photographers were celebrating and glorifying their city and the Second Empire, demonstrating to the world that what they saw as the shared patrimony of both Paris as a city and France as a nation. In particular, they set out to depict the feats of architectural skill and beauty in photographs that would eternalize the city and disseminate its greatness to others. So in 1851, the French state created a Historic Monuments Commission, which sponsored a series of Mission Héliographique, the first large-scale government-sponsored photographic survey. It employed a number of prominent early photographers to document France's architectural heritage and spur conservation and restoration efforts across the nation. These photographers included Hippolyte Bayard, Gustave Legray, Henri Lesec, and Auguste Mestral, together with Edouard Baldus, who made several photographs featured in this lecture. Baldus was relatively new to the profession, having taken up photography in 1848 after an earlier career as a draftsman and lithographer. Baldus was an innovator within the medium, using both wet plate and dry paper negatives at times as large as 10 by 14 inches in size. And like many photographers, Baldus would at times retouch his negatives to remove details that would distract from the central photographic subject. And in many of his pictures, the structure fills the majority of the frame, creating a sense of scale and monumentality. In his photograph here of the Tuileries Palace, we can see the massive domed central structure, while the wings of the building extend beyond the edges of the photograph to demonstrate its size. This second photograph reveals Baldus's motives even more clearly. The work documents the new construction at the Tuileries Palace and the Louvre, commissioned by Napoleon III. This and other photographs were presented in albums to the emperor and other officials. They were eventually combined to create the album Vues de Paris en photographie, Photographic Views of Paris, from which these pictures are taken. Like the earlier image, this photograph is monumental in its effect. It was likely taken from a vantage point of a high floor inside the Louvre, allowing Baldus to capture the full extent of the garden and the Tuileries Palace in the distance. Again, the buildings extend beyond the edges of the photograph. In the foreground, we can see two small figures who were deliberately posed. They would have been instructed by Baldus to remain completely still the moment that he began exposing the negative and until the exposure was finished. The two men appear as passersby, captured haphazardly, but in fact, they were placed there on purpose in order to create and increase this monumental effect of the building by giving us a human scale by which to measure it. Baldus is not simply documenting the building. He's using his art to recreate its monumentality for his audience. His work demonstrates the power of the camera to represent architecture and its ability to render light and volume onto a two-dimensional surface with the clarity that the new medium made possible. So Baldus focused primarily on the exterior of what he saw as the most important buildings in Paris, landmarks that were emblematic of the city's stature. Here on the left, we see his photograph of the medieval church Sainte-Chapelle, again taken from a higher vantage point. Baldus makes sure that the highest point of the spire coincides with the uppermost edge of the image, guiding the viewer's eyes toward heaven. Other photographers of the Mission héliographique, such as Auguste Mestral with his photograph on the right, focused more on the specific architectural details of the buildings they documented, highlighting the work of the contemporary craftsmen to preserve and restore the structure. Here, Mestral depicts a statue of an angel ready to be installed on the upper tiers of the spire. Like many religious buildings, Sainte-Chapelle suffered neglect and even desecration during the French Revolution, and the photographers associated with the Mission héliographique wanted to document the efforts taking place in the mid-19th century to restore them to their former glory. It's a great one. So this focus on architectural detail is also evident in this anonymous photograph of a gargoyle from the Cathedral of Notre Dame, whose newness suggests that it was part of a restoration project. Its pristine stone contrasts sharply with the worn and encrusted stone beside it. Although the background is not clear in the photograph, it is just possible to make out the city below. The gargoyle, which would become known as le strige, or the screech owl, was purely ornamental, and unlike gargoyles proper, it did not serve as a drainage conduit for excess water. The gargoyle was sculpted as part of the major restoration project conducted in the 19th century under the supervision of architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. In fact, documenting Viollet-le-Duc's restoration efforts throughout the city was a foundational aim of the Mission Héliographique. So while photographers focused on the restoration of existing structures, they also wanted to document new additions and constructions. In 1855, Baldus was commissioned to photograph the construction site of the new Louvre, recording for architect Hector Lefeuille each decorative element and ornamental sculpture that was created for the new wings that would connect the Louvre and the Tuileries Palace. And this work by Baldus depicts one of the plaster models of the ornate columns that had been crafted for the project. The capital of this column contains winged creatures, including owls and bats. Others contain a range of grotesque animals, including cows and even snarling lions. Baldus was retained by Lefeuille to document the construction site on the instructions of Napoleon III's Minister of State, Achille Fould, who explained to the emperor in an 1856 report, quote, "In the interest of art and in order to preserve for history the models, numbering more than 800, that were executed by the sculptors of the new Louvre, I charged the architect with making reproductions of them by means of photography," a word that he placed in quotation marks to highlight the novelty of the medium. Baldus's photographs allowed the architect to keep track of the countless plaster models that were assembled as part of the project and later translated into stone. At the same time, as the quote makes clear, Baldus's photographs were understood not simply for their utilitarian purpose as an aid for the architect, but also were understood in terms of a greater purpose, for preserving the history of art, establishing a new art of the archive, and offering a new model for photographic representation. Baldus published the photographs in albums with 4 volumes in each set, with a total of over 2,000 plates. And starting in 1869, he started to publish these photographs as in photogravure form in 3 volumes, each one with 100 plates, titled Palais du Louvre et des Tuileries. Baldus's photogravures, like this one here, were characterized by their clarity and exquisite detail, and he often even added his own etched lines to his prints by hand. So photographers also wanted to document the creation of new monumental structures, most notably the Opéra Garnier, which was built between 1861 and 1875 to house the Paris Opera. Named after its architect, Charles Garnier, the new opera house was opulent and magnificent, capable of seating almost 2,000 members in its audience. Louis-Émile Durandel, who photographed the construction of the Eiffel Tower also, was hired to document its construction, and his images would later appear in a commemorative album, Le Nouvel Opéra de Paris, the New Paris Opera, published after the opera house was completed. On the left, Durandel has captured the construction of the exterior frieze of the building, with its elaborate sculptural ornamentation, and unusually, he has also included one of the many stonemasons who were engaged in the project, as you can see at the center, perhaps to give a sense of scale or as an acknowledgement of their contribution. On the right, you can see a fragment of a stone panel showcasing the decorative chisel work with its striking gargoyle, here intended as a conduit for wastewater. Durandel photographed each sculptural element on its own, highlighting the idiosyncrasies of the isolated parts before they would be lifted into place and integrated into a carefully planned facade or interior. The construction of the Palais Garnier marked an important collaboration between architect and photographer that set a precedent for the following decades. So while this sense of cultural pride that's evident in many of these early photographs of the architecture of Paris is visible in this interior scene of the Salon Carré, the Delacroix Gallery at the Exposition Universelle, taken in 1855, pictured at left. The Salon Carré was the grandest and most important exhibition space in the Louvre at the time, here recreated on the Avenue Montaigne for the Exposition Universelle of 1855, which celebrated French industry and culture in a way that meant to overshadow and surpass the earlier Crystal Palace exposition in London. The photograph's creator, André Adolphe Eugène Didery, shows the gallery filled with paintings by the artist Eugène Delacroix that are hung next to and above each other in the style that was typical of salon exhibits at the time. Pictured on the right, we see an interior of the Exposition Universelle of 1878, which was held at the Palais du Trocadéro and which set out to celebrate the recovery of France after the 1870 to 1871 Franco-Prussian War. And while diverse in their subject matter, the photographs in the earliest section of Eternal Paris are united by the common motives that the different photographers brought to their work. For each, Paris was more than simply a city. It was an embodiment of French history, traditions, and culture, and they approached their subjects with pride, reverence, and even love. Paris was a vital part of what they saw as their shared patrimony, something to be cherished and preserved through the new medium of photography. Some of the images appear to be merely documents of Paris monuments, but I urge you to think about the intense emotion with which the photographers responded to their city and the social, political, and artistic implications of their work. So the confidence of the earlier photographers in their venerable and monumental city was shattered by the French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War and the insurrection that led to the Paris Commune. The Franco-Prussian War began on July 16, 1870, and ended in the complete defeat of the French forces and the capture of the Emperor Napoleon III at the Battle of Sedan. Although the French fought on after Napoleon's capture, the war effectively ended with the fall of Paris to Prussian forces on January 28, 1871. In place of the Second Empire, the French instituted the Third Republic, and in the negotiated peace with Prussia, France was forced to surrender the German-speaking regions of Alsace and Lorraine, which Prussia would retain until the end of World War I. Paris had been defended by the National Guard, and influenced by working-class radicalism, they seized control of the city, refusing to recognize the authority of the new republic. Paris was quickly surrounded by forces loyal to the Republic, and what followed was a siege that lasted 2 months in which hunger spread throughout the capital. The communards, as they were called, passed a range of reforms in the 2 short months that they were in power. They outlawed Catholic schools, advocated for the rights of women, and took prominent hostages, including the Archbishop of Paris, whom they later executed. Republican forces retook the city over the course of the Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week, in which as many as 20,000 communards were executed. By the fall of the Commune, large areas of the city stood in ruins. Paris's photographers were quick to document the destruction, and their photographs constitute the second section of this lecture. So this photograph by an anonymous photographer was taken on March 18, 1871, the day on which the National Guard seized control of the city. The National Guardsmen, aided by the Paris workers, took advantage of Paris's narrow streets to erect barricades. Here we see them on the Rue Saint-Sébastien in the 11th arrondissement. While the other photographers focus on the destruction that followed, here we see the unity and optimism that lay behind the Commune. The soldiers are dressed in uniform, but among them we can see civilians who have joined them, one even bringing a young child to stand proudly in front of the barricades. It appears that the communards have even taken barrels from the wine shop in the left of the image, if you can make that out, to reinforce their barricade. The photograph captures the spirit of resistance and the hope of a more equal future in which barriers of class would be broken down. The reality is that in all likelihood, many of the figures in this image would not survive the bloody week to come. The next photograph here is by François-Marie Louis Alexandre Gobinet de Villecholle, what a name, who published his work under the pseudonym Franck. much more succinct. The Rue Royale is a major Parisian thoroughfare, connecting the Madeleine with the Place de la Concorde. Franck captures the destructive power of the Republican artillery, and in the center of the image, we see the remnants of the barricade that contrasts sharply with the optimism of the previous anonymous photograph. The empty kiosk, once used to sell newspapers, the broken fire hydrant, and the broken street lamp in the bottom right are emblematic of the disruption of daily life. This once busy street, home to numerous stores, now stands deserted, filled with the rubble from the battle and devoid of people. The photograph captures the extent of the destruction of the city as it fell to Republican forces and the enormous task that the people of Paris would face to rebuild their city. It also shows the enduring impulse among Parisian photographers to use the camera as a tool to testify to their city's trauma and to create a visual record for posterity. So Diderot's photograph of the Rue de Lille is taken from a series that he published in 1871, documenting the destruction of Paris during the Commune. While the buildings alongside have received only minimal damage, the interior of the building at the center has been completely destroyed. He took photographs both during and after the Commune, and this picture clearly dates from the latter period. The rubble has been cleared from the streets, and although some remains neatly stacked beneath the window of the building on the right and on the sidewalk in front of the central building, perhaps this was for use for subsequent rebuilding. Even so, the image is haunting. The streets are deserted, and again, the empty kiosk symbolizes the suspension of city life. This photograph, also taken by Diderot, captures the destruction done to the Pont d'Anières, a major bridge located on the outskirts of Paris. The iron infrastructure has collapsed in several of the sections, highlighting the immense challenges that rebuilding would pose. The photograph also highlights the difficulties Parisians faced moving in and out of the city and the loss of access that they would experience in the years following the conflict. This photograph of the Tuileries is from a series of 45 photographs collected and published in an album under the title Insurrection de Paris by J.W. Wolfe the Younger. Otherwise relatively unknown, Wolfe set out to document the aftermath of the destruction of the Commune. Here, Wolfe shows how the war reached even the most monumental of Paris's buildings. This is the same Tuileries that Baldus photographed so proudly only 13 years earlier. The roof of the building has been substantially destroyed by shell fire from the Army of the Republic, perhaps because it was used as a place of shelter or vantage by the communards. In front of the building, we can see a series of wagons, perhaps assembled to assist in the cleanup efforts that followed the fall of the Commune. So Wolfe's picture here of the Rue Royale at the corner of the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré shows the process of consolidating what remained of the ruined city. On the left of the photograph, we can see the hastily erected wooden supports to prevent the building from collapsing. In contrast to the carefully posed male figures in the earlier Baldus photograph of the Louvre and the Tuileries, who paused long enough for the image to be fully exposed on the negative. The ghost-like figures at the bottom left and center, I don't know if you can see, of this photograph, capture passers-by, likely walking past the scene as they resumed their daily routines. The fact that the male figure at the bottom center is better exposed and has his back to the camera suggests that he had paused long enough to survey the destruction. Finally, in this photograph of Paris's famous Rue de Rivoli, taken by Wolf, we can see the rebuilding efforts that took place later in the year. There is wooden scaffolding on the left-hand side of the building, and interestingly, the stone merchant has erected a banner to advertise his business, quote, Les Magasins de Pierre. As in the previous photograph, we can see the ghost-like figures of passers-by in the bottom right corner as Paris slowly returns to life after the destruction. So both before and after the Commune, Parisian photographers were already documenting what they saw as the rapid modernization of the city and its place as an advanced metropolis in an industrialized world. This transition is documented most notably in the work of two legendary Parisian photographers, Charles Marville and Eugène Atget. Marville took up photography in 1850 in his late 30s after an earlier career as an engraver and maker of woodblocks. He earned his living primarily from photographing works of art, eventually becoming the official photographer for the Musée du Louvre. Marville was also determined to document the changes taking place in his city, as many of its narrow medieval streets were being knocked down to make way for the wide central boulevards created by Baron Haussmann from the 1850s onward until his dismissal in 1870. When Haussmann's work ceased, he claimed that 1 out of every 5 streets in the city was his creation. This photograph here of the Rue Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, taken by Marville from the Rue des Prêtres Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, captures exactly the kind of narrow cobbled street that Haussmann saw as incompatible with his vision of Paris, where grand boulevards provided majestic sightlines between the city's major monuments. In addition, such streets, as the 1848 revolution had shown, were easily barricaded. Removing them, as both Haussmann and Napoleon III were aware, was a way of suppressing insurrection under the guise of beautifying the city. For Marville, however, such streets were objects of beauty, and he wanted to use the new medium of photography to preserve them for posterity. For Marville, the patrimony of Paris existed in these streets, rather than in the monumental architecture that was the chief concern of the photographers earlier associated with the Mission Héliographique. At the same time, Marville wanted to document the process of change. Here we see a modern hackney carriage, a product of its time, making its way down a centuries-old street. These two photographs here are from a series that Marville was commissioned to make of the gas-fueled street lamps that were being installed throughout the city and would become iconic features of Paris and hallmarks of the new French architectural style. They were seen as making the city safer and encouraged businesses to stay open later, stimulating the commercial life of the city. The picture on the left was taken on the Rue de l'Opéra, one of the new streets built by Haussmann. Every neighborhood had its own individualized street lamp design, and Marville's photographs of them were shown at the Exposition Universelle of 1878, celebrating Paris as a new modern city. As you can see in the image on the right, this street lamp, located in the courtyard of the railway station at Sceaux, is very different, with a more austere design suited to its utilitarian setting. In the background, you can see newly planted trees, emblematic of the new orderly, meticulously designed city. Born in 1857, Eugène Atget became a photographer at the age of 30 after a problem with his vocal cords put an end to his acting career. He began photographing Paris in the late 1880s, moving through its streets as a flaneur in search of scenes to capture. He sold some of his pictures to institutions, including the Bibliothèque Historique de la Ville de Paris, eventually selling thousands of his negatives to a range of institutions in the early 1920s. Like Marville, Atget was concerned with documenting change, recording both the old city and its new transformations. Like Marville, he was interested in the old Paris, or Vieux Paris, of which he compiled a collection of views. At the same time, he recognized and recorded the inevitable changes ushered in by the Haussmannization of the city. So here we see his photograph of the Pont Neuf, the oldest standing bridge in Paris, begun in the late 16th century and inaugurated by Henry IV in 1607. Atget juxtaposes the ancient structure with the industrial life of the modern city. Henry IV's equestrian statue, situated next to two clearly visible street lamps, looks down on an enormous barge being loaded at the bank of the Seine below, with a stream of wagons bringing debris to be emptied into the barge's hold. In the background, we see buildings that overlook the Place Dauphine. Another barge is visible in the left of the photograph, coming out from beneath the bridge. And the Seine, as Atget captures it, is a major artery of commerce, an important element within the overall economy of the city. On the barges, several human figures are visible at work, and they serve to reveal the scale of the barge. This striking photograph of a Parisian tramway à chevaux, a horse-drawn tram, captures the bustle of modern Paris. The tram is stopped at a tramway station on the Boulevard Saint-Michel near the Luxembourg Gardens and is heading in the direction of the Gare de l'Est, as the sign on the upper rear of the carriage makes clear, en route from Montrouge in the south of the city. The interior and the upper deck are both already full, and more passengers are preparing to board, getting ready to hand their money or their ticket to the conductor who stands on the stair. Behind the central tramway, another is seen moving away. Anticipating later street photographers, Atget presents Paris bustling with life as its people move in different directions as they go about their day. Even though he insisted on using a large wooden camera and glass plates that measured 9.5 by 7 inches, Atget's picture conveys a sense of immediacy, capturing a single moment of life on Paris's streets that is emblematic of the modern city. In this second photograph, also by Atget, we see a double-decker omnibus drawn by 3 horses, stopped by the side of the road. The driver is absent, and the reins hang loose, but the conductor is visible on the back of the stair of the vehicle. The omnibus, as we can just make out on the sign along its side, plied the route between La Villette and Saint-Sulpice, one of many such routes that, by the time the photograph was taken in 1910, covered much of the city. The omnibuses reflected the routinization of Parisian life, increasingly governed by timetables and schedules as they moved along the new wide boulevards that Haussmann had created. While hard to imagine today, the omnibuses were symbols of modernity, a modernity that Atget sought to capture in his photographs. But at the same time, Atget understood that these omnibuses would already soon disappear from the urban landscape, as they would later be eclipsed by steam trams and later motorized streetcars. Many of Atget's photographs, however, are documents of the older Paris that was rapidly disappearing to make room for the new. In this view of the Rue de la Montagne Saint-Geneviève, taken in 1926, we see one of the narrow medieval streets that appear so often in the work of Marville. The photograph combines elements of tradition and modernity. We see the small shops, including a beer store, a creamery, a charcuterie, an épicerie, and a wooden cart loaded with produce. There is even a bal, one of the old dance clubs popular during the Belle Époque. that is just barely visible halfway along the Rue de la Montagne Saint-Geneviève. There's also a modern automobile intruding from the left side of the photograph, creating a sharp contrast with the horse-drawn carriage in the center of the image, emblematic of the more general intrusion of modernity into the old Paris that Atget loved so much. Atget's work captures Paris on the brink of change, and his aim was to catalog the streets and way of life that he knew would one day no longer exist. Although he depicted the city as it existed around him, there is a deep thread of nostalgia in Atget's photographs. His work dates from after the Haussmannization of Paris, and even though the streets he photographed were still standing, much as they had in medieval times, the destruction wrought by Haussmann evoked in Atget and others a love for Vieux Paris and all that it represented to them. Atget provides a portrait of Paris taken at a pivotal moment in its history. As his calling card from the period announced, he was, quote, E. Atget, creator and purveyor of a collection of photographic views of old Paris. The title of this lecture is Eternal Paris, but that does not mean that the city has not changed. Atget's work demonstrates the power of the camera as a tool for preservation, a way of freezing in time the ephemeral and the evanescent, a way to leave posterity with a lasting visual record of the past. Not all of Atget's contemporaries, however, looked to preserve Vieux Paris. Others embraced modernity and the development of Paris as a thriving metropolis. Here we see Louis-Gabriel Lopé's photograph of the péniches, or barges, on the Seine, taken around 1900. The artist presents the Seine as a bustling waterway filled with barges and steam-powered tugs, and spanned by the Pont Neuf in the distance. While Atget, in the photograph shown earlier, used the bridge to represent old Paris, in Lopé's photograph, the bridge acts as a frame on the horizon line of the image, brightly illuminated by its many street lamps. The photograph evokes industrial power and progress. The absence of human figures suggests that it was taken at dawn, as the working city was beginning to awake. This photograph from around 1911 captures a bustling Paris street, featuring a horse-drawn omnibus, motor cars, and a man transporting goods on a tricycle. The bustle of the city is evoked by the fact that the pedestrians are walking in different directions, each following their own path, a characteristic of busy modern life. The fact that the omnibus is blurred reflects that it is in motion, in contrast to the stationary omnibus captured by Atget. The photograph was taken on one of the wide boulevards that Haussmann created. This is the Paris of the photographer's own time, not reminiscent of any medieval past. On the right of the picture is a man holding an umbrella, reminiscent of Gustave Caillebott's 1877 Paris Street Rainy Day. As in Caillebott's painting, the figures are isolated, the setting is a grand boulevard, and the image is even bisected by a solitary street lamp. This is the modern city, where people go about their lives separately and individually, while organically part of the greater social community. So the final section of this lecture brings together photographs from the early 20th century that are linked by the desire to capture and celebrate the city's energy and vibrant street life. Paris, perhaps more than any other city in the world, is a city of attractions. And of course, it is impossible to imagine Paris without thinking of the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower was the main attraction of the 1889 Exposition Universelle, intended to symbolize Paris's recovery from the destruction of the Franco-Prussian War and the insurrection of the Commune, and it was integral to the centennial celebrations of the French Revolution. Its popularity continued in the years that followed and endures today. At the time it was built, Gustave Eiffel's 312-meter, or 1,024-foot tower was the tallest human-made structure in the world, a controversial industrial monument in steel that disrupted Haussmann's vision of the city. In fact, one of the main reasons its construction was permitted was that it was slated to be demolished after no more than 20 years. The new tower, however, attracted the attention of artists and photographers who helped to cement its place as the primary emblem of Paris. Henri Rivière, for example, utilized a camera to document the tower's construction, using his photographs as the basis of a series of lithographs called Les 36 vues de la Tour Eiffel, 36 views of the Eiffel Tower, published in 1902, seen on the left. To the right, we see Georges Seurat's painting of the tower, and the speckled daubs of paint, characteristic of the pointillist style, evoke what would become an enduring association between the tower and light as it stood silhouetted against the Parisian sky. So this photograph here is by Louis-Gabriel Lopé, who took the earlier picture of the barges on the Seine. As early as 1889, the tower had been lit up at night by a complex system of gas jets. Here, Lopé captured the tower at night, illuminated by the electric lights that were installed for the Exposition Universelle of 1900. The photograph was taken from the balcony of Lopé's apartment at number 14 Avenue du Trocadéro, today Avenue du President Wilson, looking out towards the Champ de Mars. The effect is dramatic. The outline of the tower looks almost as if it is engraved or etched into its surface. Also visible in the left of the image is the Grande Roue de Paris, the Great Wheel of Paris, a 100-meter Ferris wheel that remained the tallest in the world until it was demolished in 1920. The medium of photography is, after all, about drawing with light. And it's not surprising that the spectacle of the illuminated tower was popular with Parisian photographers, whose images isolated the sparkling tower from the darkened city and celebrated its nighttime luminescence. The photographer Bresson, best known for his pictures of nighttime Parisian street life and the interior scenes of Paris's demi-monde, took this photograph in 1929. As the illuminated dates at the foot of the tower reveal, the tower was lit up specifically to celebrate the 40th anniversary of its construction. As the grille visible on the left of the image reveals, Bresson took the photograph from inside of a nearby building. The grille acts as a partition between the interior and exterior spaces. The tower in Bresson's photograph is not merely a monument, it is part of the daily fabric of Parisian life. On the left of the image, there is a leafless tree, suggesting that the photograph was taken in winter, and its uppermost branches align with the top of the tower. The distance between them gives the viewer a sense of scale. Even from afar, the Eiffel Tower is an imposing structure. The Eiffel Tower also features as the backdrop for one of the most iconic photographs in our collection. The modernist photographer Pierre de Breuil's photograph, Elle est Fantaisie, depicts Emmanuel Frémier's life-sized bronze sculpture of a young elephant caught in a trap, rearing up in pain in its effort to escape. The sculpture was commissioned for the Exposition Universelle of 1878, and it was noted for its careful attention to detail that places it firmly within the genre of academic realism. The sculpture is now located outside of the Musée d'Orsay. To make this photograph, de Breuil used a telephoto lens to compress the space between the two forms, emphasizing the stylistic distance between them. Frémier's naturalistic depiction of the elephant stands in stark contrast with Eiffel's modern industrial structure. The photograph shocked many when it was exhibited, and it continues to attract widespread attention today. In this photograph by André Cortège, the Eiffel Tower functions as a symbol of the future, the focus of the gaze of a solitary figure walking along the street, a common trope in Cortège's work. We see a quiet Parisian street with workers on the sidewalks going about their daily lives. The Rue du Château is in the 14th arrondissement, away from the bustling center of Paris, but the Eiffel Tower is still visible in the distance and is part of the experience of the people who live in this neighborhood. For the solitary figure, most likely a young man wearing the cape required as part of his school uniform, the tower represents a destination, the lodestar of his journey along the cobbled street. Cortège, like Versailles, was born in Hungary and moved to Paris in 1925. The city was his home until fears of impending war and concerns for his safety as a Jew prompted him to emigrate to the United States, where he continued his career until his death in 1985. Paris was the subject of his first published collection of photographs, and this picture reveals many of the qualities that make him a seminal figure of 20th century photography, known for his contributions to photographic composition and the photo essay. The final photograph I would like to discuss is by Ilse Bing, depicting the entrance of the Moulin Rouge, one of the iconic venues of Paris and an emblem of the Belle Époque. Taken in 1931, the year that Bing first came to Paris from her native Frankfurt, it features the structure as it was rebuilt after a devastating fire in 1915. The venue was co-founded in 1889 by Charles Zidler and Joseph Aller, and it was where the famous can-can dance originated. Bing was a German Jew who, like Cortège, succeeded in escaping to New York when the Germans invaded France. Dubbed the Queen of the Leica, Bing was known for her modernist experimental style, and in particular, her use of solarization, a technique that involves reversing tones by either exposing the negative or the print to excess light. Embracing both abstraction and realism, Bing's work draws heavily upon the spontaneity that the new handheld 35mm camera made possible. This photograph shows the foyer of the theater with the large illuminated sign pointing in the direction of the theater's museum. The crowd is gathered in the background, getting ready for the night's show. This is one photograph from a series that Bing took at the Moulin Rouge, mostly of the dancers in motion. Using her nimble, portable Leica camera loaded with high-speed film to shoot at night, Bing was able to make this photograph in low-light conditions, and the small size of her 35mm negative accounts for the graininess evident here when the image was enlarged and printed. Under-recognized in comparison to her male counterparts, Bing and her avant-garde documentary style are critical to the history of 20th century photography. So Bing was drawn to the Moulin Rouge, I would argue, by the same artistic imperatives that drove all of the photographers in this lecture to photograph the city of Paris. Taking a closer look at the work of these photographers reveals that each sought to capture scenes that they believed embodied and represented the abiding qualities of their city, and to preserve these images permanently, perhaps even eternally, through the medium of photography. For the photographers of the mid-19th century associated with the Mission Héliographique, what counted was recording the architectural patrimony of their city, and they were naturally drawn to its monumental buildings and participated in their preservation by providing records of their construction and restoration. Their deep aesthetic love of their city and its cultural heritage is what drove photographers to document its destruction during the Communard insurrection and its aftermath. More than simply records, these photographs, I believe, were intended as eulogies to the fallen city. The combined emotions of loss, celebration, and pride pervade the photographs I have presented, from the nostalgia for Vieux Paris, the medieval city gradually being torn down to make way for the modern city that Haussmann began, to the celebration of the wonders of the new age, embodied in the technological brilliance of the Eiffel Tower and the enduring attractions of the city. The Paris that exists in their photographs rarely includes the mundane lived experiences of its citizens. Instead, what you have seen is an exercise in myth-making. I am not talking about a conscious effort to present a sanitized or glorified version of the city, and still less would I characterize the series as a form of visual propaganda, although many of the photographers reflect the enormous cultural pride that their creators felt in their city and their nation. Rather, these photographers, I would suggest, shared an unconscious desire to memorialize and celebrate their city as something unique among metropolitan centers, and to identify the sites and scenes that captured that uniqueness most perfectly. The result was the creation of the Paris myth through the use of the new instantaneous and reproducible medium of photography that froze an enduring image of eternal Paris in our popular imagination. If you close your eyes and think of Paris, you will likely imagine the sights and the scenes present in the work of these photographers, and like them, be convinced you are seeing Paris as it really is. Thank you. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I can repeat them. I'd argue that they were definitely aware that they were participating. And so the question was, to what extent were the photographers aware that they were participating in the process of myth-making around Paris? And I'd say that they were. The earlier photographers saw their mission as documenting what they saw as the cultural and architectural patrimony of both Paris and France at large. And they were drawn to the monumental and what they saw as the outstanding buildings of the capital. But later photographers, especially Versailles, who photographed the Eiffel Tower, were aware of its emblematic importance as well as its monumental form. I think the myth of Paris was already in existence around the turn of the century, right at the height of the Belle Epoque era. It's interesting to note also that Ilse Bing, in the last photograph that I showed when she arrived in Paris in 1931, that she was drawn to the Moulin Rouge, which we see as somehow, even today, still representative of Paris itself. She also made remarkable photographs, modernist photographs of the Eiffel Tower that show its construction, but we unfortunately don't have any of those in the collection. Yes? The question was, well, he wants to go to Paris, as I think we all do. I hope this lecture could transport you through the pictures. I was wondering if the collection at the museum stops at this point or if it continues on past this time period. And it does continue on. We have photographs that continue well into the 20th century. But I've deliberately stopped at this point because to focus the lecture. I can't cover everything, but to constrain it to a time. But yes, there are more pictures, and in the exhibition that I'm organizing, there will be some later pictures that go up to sort of Second World War. I mean, yes, the question is that was Baron Haussmann and Napoleon III, were they collaborating with photographers, sort of like commissioning photographers in a sense to photograph and make images of the newly rebuilt city? Yes. Some of the pictures that I've shown today were part of those commissions. Baldus, for example, the images of the new Louvre, that was a direct commission that he received from the government to document this major restoration project that, as I said, connected the Louvre and the Tuileries Palace. So really, I think they were aware, even though photography was, in its infancy, it was already understood as being a powerful tool for communication and for glorification and for record keeping too. So they absolutely were. But then it also created as well a backlash, as I explained, how it made photographers become nostalgic to think, wow, some of these streets that we've lived among that are historic and medieval are no longer going to exist, and that it was that documentary impulse to want to preserve that I think is arguably, just as interesting, both. Sure, I mean, I think that the photographers tried to, photograph on both sides. I think showing the destruction of the Commune, for example, is not placing blame on any, that it was destruction brought by, both Republican forces and the Communards. Yeah, well, it's unfortunate. The question is that all of the photographers are male except for one, Ilse Bing. I wish that there would have been more working women photographers at the time. There were very few women photographers working at that time, and many of the photographs that we've seen were part of larger commissioned projects that were to document the architectural construction and restoration projects. And at the time, unfortunately, most women were not going to be hired for that type of project. To be honest, I wish that there were more women photographers on this topic to draw upon. But it's also worth noting that the American photographer Bernice Abbott, who met Atget in Paris while she was working as Man Ray's assistant, was instrumental in preserving and popularizing Atget's work throughout his lifetime. And in 1927, she purchased his estate and eventually sold his collection to the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So while women don't necessarily feature prominently in the presentation, it's important to acknowledge their influence in making this work known. Yes, Ron. Absolutely, that's a great question. The question is, was there a collaboration between photographers and printmakers at the time who were depicting similar subjects? And I would say absolutely yes. I mean, I gave as one example Henri Rivière, who used the camera not to make his art, but used it as a tool in order to make his prints. And so he went out, he couldn't be dangling on the construction of the Eiffel Tower and, making, etchings. He couldn't do that. So photography and the camera allowed for more mobility, different vantage points, and it was used as a tool in the process of creating work in other mediums. So photography, I think, radically influenced other mediums, for printmaking, for painting, for sculpture. So it was used to both ends as its own art, but also sort of as a preparatory process. And then the artists would use those images as the basis for doing their printmaking or other work. I think that's. Oh. Yeah. There is not. I wish that we could do publications for every project and every exhibition, but perhaps for a future project. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming here today.